Hi, everyone. In this video, I want to answer the question, what is critical thinking? And to do that, I'm going to share this handout with you. This handout is based on material from multiple sources, especially chapters 1 and 2 of Bradley H. Dowden's Logical Reasoning. And Professor Dowden is generous enough to have shared his textbook with us on the internet. And so I'm going to provide a link to that down below in the description. To start off, let's do some definitions. First off, philosophy. The word philosophy actually means the love of wisdom, and wisdom involves thinking, right? Well, critical thinking is usually taught in a philosophy class, although philosophers don't have a monopoly on critical thinking. And critical thinking is connected to logic. Logic is the toolkit used for critical thinking. And by the way, Aristotle is the father of logic, at least that's what we call him. What is critical thinking? So Dowden, the answer I'm going to give you to that is careful thinking. Critical thinking is careful thinking. Dowden describes it this way as high quality or perceptive thinking. Lewis Vaughan, who has authored his own critical thinking text, says, quote, "Our thinking had better be good. Almost every day we are hit by a blizzard of assertions, opinions, arguments, and pronouncements from all directions. They all implore us to believe, to agree, to accept, to follow, to submit. And we can't accept all of them. All of these claims that are coming at us, these assertions, we can't accept them all because many of them are contradictory. So they can't all be right. Many of them will mislead us, and many of them are just plain dangerous." Another definition of critical thinking is the following, quote, "The use of rational skills, worldviews, and values to get as close as possible to the truth." But what is truth? So here's a definition for you. The classical definition of truth from Aristotle is, quote, "The truth is saying what is, and what is not, is not." This is the correspondence theory of truth, which means when what you say corresponds with the way things are, you get truth. When what you say corresponds with reality, then it is true. Now, you've probably heard this common objection, this common notion that there are no absolute truths. Well, it's easy to show that this is wrong, because if you just take that statement literally, then that statement itself is self-refuting. It assumes that there is an absolute truth, at least one, and that is the fact that there are no absolute truths. Well, this makes no sense. It's self-refuting. If it's true, it's false. Harry Frankfurt says, "No one in his right mind would rely on a builder or submit to the care of a physician who does not care about the truth." And that seems right. Blaise Pascal, the famous mathematician and philosopher, says, quote, "Truth is so obscure nowadays and lies so well established that unless we love the truth, we shall never recognize it." So let's consider some obstacles to critical thinking. Vaughan classifies obstacles to critical thinking into two categories, psychological and philosophical. As an example of a psychological obstacle, he talks about self-interest. He says, "Devotion to yourself can prevent careful evaluation of claims, limit critical inquiry, blind you to the facts, provoke self-deception, engender rationalizations, lead you to suppress or ignore evidence, and beget wishful thinking. And these mistakes can decrease your chances of success and hamper your personal growth, maturity, and self-awareness. Such egocentrism can also leave you wide open to propaganda and manipulation by people who appeal to your personal desires and prejudices." So that's an example of a psychological obstacle, this egocentrism or self-interest. We need to be careful that we aren't blinded by our own desires and prejudices, as he says. But I'm going to consider more carefully these philosophical obstacles he discusses. There are three: subjectivism, cultural relativism, and skepticism. Subjectivism is also known as personal epistemic relativism. I know that's a bit technical, but this is the definition here. It is what is true depends on what you believe. So what are the problems with this approach to life? What is true depends on what you believe. Well, it appears to be self-refuting in the same way or similar way that the statement above was self-refuting, the statement that there are no absolute truths. Because if you take this statement, what is true depends on what you believe, if we take it on its face value, if we take it literally, then this statement seems to be meant as a fact that is not just an opinion or a subjective preference. It is a statement about reality. But that seems to assume some sort of objectivism. And so then if it's true, it's false, you see. So it's self-refuting. The next one is cultural relativism, and we might call that social epistemic relativism. And it's defined as what is true depends on what your culture says is true. Now, the scope of this theory is broader than the previous one because it's not just about you. In this case, it's about your culture, but it seems to be vulnerable to the same criticism that it is self-refuting, because it seems to be a statement that means to transcend culture. It means to be a statement about the way things are universally, but it says the opposite. It says that what is true depends on what your culture says is true. So if we take it to be an objective statement, if it's true, it's also false. So it's self-refuting. Okay, moving on to skepticism. Skepticism is the claim that we know much less than we think or nothing at all. As Vaughan says, skeptics think knowledge requires certainty. But is this true? Does knowledge require certainty? So a flat earther might attack your view that the earth is round by saying that you've never seen the shape of the earth, so how can you know for certain? And since knowledge requires certainty, you don't know that the shape of the earth is round. And as far as we know, how we perceive it, it's flat. When you look out the window, it's flat. And so therefore the earth is flat. So the trouble that the flat earther gets into is this assumption that knowledge requires certainty. But something we've learned from philosophy is that if you require certainty for knowledge, you get into all kinds of problems. And I'll just appeal to Rene Descartes, who in the history of philosophy, he sat down one day and wanted to apply this, what we call of him, the methodological doubt. He wanted to doubt everything in order to find something certain on which he could build his philosophy. In the process of that, though, he couldn't even be certain that he wasn't dreaming at the moment. And as I do this exercise with students, it's a fun and frustrating exercise to try to prove and to try to give some evidence that we can actually be certain of. Now, Descartes thought he found a solution to it, but many philosophers think that he was unsuccessful in that, and to this day is still stuck in his dream state, if you will, and never fully proving that he can have knowledge or a foundation like he wants to have. So what does this mean for us? Is it possible to doubt that the earth is round? I think it is. I think it's possible that the earth is flat, but I don't think it's reasonable. And here's where I make this distinction here: possible doubt versus reasonable doubt. So reasonable doubt is a doubt that conforms to the rules of reasons. A doubt that you have good reason to entertain. So is it good enough to doubt what science or NASA says about the shape of the earth just because they've been wrong in the past? Or is the scientific method reliable enough even with all its flaws? And I would assert that even in spite of all its flaws, the scientific method is a reliable method, and we don't need to have certainty in order to have knowledge. So moving on, I'm going to skip down a little bit here to talk about virtues versus skills. Now, in a previous video, I discussed critical thinking in terms of intellectual virtues. In Dowden's book, he approaches it in terms of skills, having a skill set or following certain principles or rules. Now, the virtues, I've got an example just above there. A virtue like open-mindedness should help the person who cultivates it to acquire truth. So a virtue like open-mindedness is necessary for truth, I would claim, or knowledge. Nevertheless, someone who is open-minded would want to follow certain rules. They would want to apply certain skills. And Dowden says his book on logical reasoning is about learning 5 skills. Number 1, writing logically. Number 2, detecting inconsistency and lack of clarity. Number 3, spotting issues and arguments. And number 4, detecting and avoiding fallacies. And number 5, generating and improving arguments and explanations. And he has a long list here of principles of logical reasoning that I'm not going to cover here. You can look here on this handout, or you can look at his book, which again I will provide a link to in the description below. Anyway, I hope that was helpful.